The seven deadly sins, also known as the capital vices or cardinal sins, is a grouping and classification of vices within Christian, particularly Catholic teachings. They are pride, greed, wrath, envy, lust, gluttony, and sloth, which are contrary to the seven heavenly virtues. Knowing this, I wanted to go over and see which of the Soulsborne characters would fit each of the sins perfectly. Starting with pride, which is described as the excessive love of one's own excellence. And the character that fits this definition in my opinion is none other than Gwyn, the Lord of Cinder. A long time ago, in the Age of the Ancients, Gwyn stumbled upon a fire. Within this fire was a soul. This soul granted Gwyn a large amount of power. Power great enough to go up against the everlasting dragons. He didn't do this alone though, as he had help from other people who discovered their own Lord Souls. However, Gwyn's was the most powerful. With this army, he waged war against the dragons and after many years defeated them. Now, Gwyn prides himself by compelling others to live by his way of life. For example, placing the dark sign on the same humans that helped him in the war just because they had an affiliation with the Abyss. The same Abyss he saw as a potential threat to his Age of Fire, the very thing he is proud of. Doing this prevented the humans from reverting back to their true forms. Gwyn also removed his firstborn son from all records in history because of his affinity towards the dragons. Gwyn probably saw this as somewhat insulting, knowing that his own son would care for the very things he fought against. He basically started the Age of Fire and built his grand kingdom and was revered to as a god due to him defeating the dragons, yet his own son would grow a liking to them. In essence, Gwyn's pride didn't want to allow the natural cycle of the world to progress because in his eyes, the Age of Fire he created is much better. Because of this, Gwyn didn't want anyone to erase what he created, so at the very end he sacrificed his own life to the first flame to keep the Age of Fire going, at least for a bit longer. Now, speaking of wanting something, we have the sin of greed, which is described as an inordinate desire to acquire or possess more than one's needs, especially with respect to material wealth or power. The person that fits this definition is Nashandra. When Manos, the father of the Abyss, was defeated, his soul shattered into many fragments, one of them being a very small one. This fragment would take physical shape, and this is how Nashandra was born. Nashandra is the embodiment of want, and she greatly desired power. She traveled all the way to Drang Lake and set eyes on King Vendrick. She decided to use her charm and seduced him into falling in love with her. Doing this allowed Nashandra to get close enough to the king. She started to quote-unquote warn him of the great threats the giants in a faraway land poses. In reality, the giants most likely weren't going to cause any disturbance to Drang Lake. However, it's Nashandra's greed that made Vendrick invade their lands to take their power and harnessed it into creating the golems. But this wasn't enough for Nashandra, as her appetite for power and dominance was insatiable. She now wanted to sit on the throne of want. However, Vendrick saw through her soul and realized that there is nothing but an empty void, and not only that, he also realized her true intentions as well. She never loved him, she was just using him to elevate herself to the throne of Wan, which would give her access to the first flame. Knowing this, Vendrick decided to create trials that a person born from the Abyss like her wouldn't be able to complete. He even hid and locked himself inside the bottom of the undead crypt so that she won't have access to the throne room. Yet this wouldn't stop Nashandra at all, as she's willing not to only wait but manipulate countless bearers of the curse to try to complete these trials, just so she could place herself on the throne. But at the end, Nashandra underestimated the bearer's strength, and one of them, being us the player, ended up defeating her. At the end, her greed for power was her ultimate downfall. Speaking of greed and desire, let's move on to lust, which is described as the disordered desire for sexual pleasure. This one's a bit tricky, as the characters of the Soulsborne universe don't really depict any lustful desires and actions, apart from a few dialogue interactions and item descriptions. For example, the Dedekar's woe item description reads, "It is said that this woman named Dedekar indulged in every form of adultery and wicked pleasure imaginable, giving birth to a myriad of grotesque children. If this was an actual physical character in the game that was shown at least once, I would have chose her, but since she isn't a physical character, I had to go with someone else, but I still thought it was, good to mention her. I could also cheat this one by saying that a character having a strong desire for something is lust, which technically wouldn't be wrong. However, I wanted to focus on the actual definition of the sin itself, which states that sexual desire plays a part. This led me to Gehrman, due to him developing a fondness for Lady Maria, which inspired the physical appearance of the doll, and Gehrman did say in a sneaky way that the hunter could, do things to the doll if they want. But despite this, I don't think Gehrman is the best representation of this sin, because I feel like he was more in love with Maria rather than just, being lustful towards her. I don't know. However, I did find someone who technically fits this sin, and that's Ariana. Ariana was born in a noble family, but due to reasons, she's now in Yharnam working as a prostitute. If you chose a male as your character and interact with her, she assumes at first that you are probably just there to pay for her services, and she tells you to come back in the morning. Now, I'm not going to go too deep into her story, as it's barely about her being a woman of pleasure, but she was the only physical character in the entire Soulsborne universe that fits lust, at least to some degree, and I've already went in depth in her entire story in one of my previous videos. Moving on to the next sin, which is envy. And the person or thing, animal, whatever, the person that belongs here is Seath the Scaleless. Envy is described as a sad or resentful covetousness towards the traits or possessions of someone else, and this defines Seath's character a lot. Seath is a part of the ancient dragon race or species, and while they had stone-like scales that protected them from all types of ailments, basically giving them immortality, Seath wasn't born with any, and not only that, he was blind as well. This made him mad and envious of the dragons, and he became obsessed with finding out ways on how to make himself immortal. He went so far to the point where he aided Gwyn and the other lords in their war against the dragons, basically betraying his own people. After defeating the dragons, Seath was gifted his own dukedom by Gwyn, and there he researched on ways to become immortal. Seath then discovered the primordial crystal, a crystal that can grant him the immortality he desired. With this crystal, he finally became somewhat immortal. However, maybe it was due to the amount of research that he was doing or the crystal itself, but Seath eventually went mad and carried out heinous experiments on humans, especially maidens, turning them into monstrosities. Now, as you can guess, the main reason why I put Seath as envy is because he was jealous of his own kind, possessing scales which made them invulnerable and long-living, while he was born feeble, being blind and deformed without any scales protecting him. His envious nature caused him to turn against the dragons in the war, aiding in their demise. The next sin I'm going to be talking about is gluttony, and it's defined as eating or drinking to excess beyond reason. I don't think this is going to come as a surprise to anyone because the person representing this sin is Aldrich. Aldrich was a cleric who gained a disgusting and heinous habit of devouring other men, and I'm pretty sure by devouring it's not in some weird cryptic way of saying that he took power from them. No, I think it's clear that he's a cannibal. He wasn't just eating a few people here and there either, because as Hawkwood told us, he devoured so many people to the point where his body became bloated and he collapsed and turned into a sludge-like creature. He began corrupting the other deacons into abandoning their fate in the Age of Fire and to trust what he believed in instead. What did he believe in, you might ask? Well, Aldrich didn't really care for the Age of Fire, as he thought that the Age of the Deep was far better. With this new purpose, Aldrich began to devour the gods. The god that we saw Aldrich devouring was Gwyndolin, who was imprisoned by Pontus Solivan just so that Aldrich could feed on him. But apart from just eating people, Aldrich is pretty scary when it comes onto his abilities. It seems like he can gain powers from people who he sees in his visions or dreams. For example, while feeding on Gwyndolin, one of the people he saw in these visions were Priscilla, and one of his attacks involves Priscilla's scythe. But all that aside, most of you can understand why he deserved this spot for sure. Now, when speaking about a gluttonous person who loves to eat a lot, most people tend to associate them with being lazy. And speaking of laziness, the next sin is sloth. Sloth is often associated with laziness, apathy, and neglect of one's duties or responsibilities. The person that fits this the most is none other than Prince Lothric. Lothric was born in royalty and he was destined to become a Lord of Cinder. The Lords of Cinder were people who linked the first flame, prolonging the Age of Fire. He was born feeble and ill, however his twin brother Lorien was the opposite as he was very strong, even defeating the Demon Prince. To be stronger together, both Lorien and Lothric merged their souls together, crippling and mutating Lorien in the process. Now, when the time came for Lothric to act on his destined duty to link the fire, he refused, and both him and his brother locked themselves away in their castle. No, Lothric didn't state outright why he didn't want to link the flame, even though he did say fire linking curse in his dialogue, which kinda comes off as him thinking keeping the fire going brings more harm than good. It still isn't outright mentioned though. Personally, I see it as a guy being fed up of everything and just wanting the world to come to an end naturally without interference. However, he still falls on the Sloth because, I mean, the guy had a duty since birth, a great one at that, and he just decided not to act on it, without a super good reason as well. Don't get me wrong though, linking the flame seems to cause more harm than good, so I do kinda get where he's coming from. And the final sin we have is wrath. Wrath is defined as a strong feeling of hatred or resentment with a desire for vengeance. There are a couple characters that fits this. For example, Kos. She was slaughtered by Gehrman and the other hunters, and because of this, she placed the entire fishing hamlet into an endless cursed nightmare, trapping any blood-drunk hunters in it. Kos's own offspring, or in better words, the offspring that wasn't technically born, could fit under wrath as well, because I mean, he has a strong hatred towards the hunters. You can tell by the way he fights and moves around. He's just filled with so much anger and hatred. Some would say that Pontiff Sulyvahn would fit the wrath description as well, but I found someone even better. The Dung Eater. The Dung Eater is a sick and twisted individual hated by many. You know this because not only was he shown to be hanged in his introduction by an angry crowd, but other characters speak ill of him as well. When we first meet Dung Eater, we see a vengeful spirit form of him. When we talk to him, he asks us if we know about the curse. The curse he's referring to is the seedbed curse. The in-game description says, "Curse grown on a corpse killed and defiled by the Dung Eater. A tender pox afflicted with omen horns. The Dung Eater cultivates the seedbed curse on corpses. By doing so, he prevents dead souls returning to the Earth Tree, leaving them forever cursed, one of the most loathsome things found in the lands between." What makes this curse really scary is the fact that if someone gets inflicted with it and reborn, they will not only be reborn as an omen, but their children and their children's children and many more after will be affected by it as well. Dung Eater's goal is to make the seedbed curse affect a lot of people so that when they are reborn as omens, they would now be seen as the norm instead of being reviled by society. Now, I haven't explained why I think he fits wrath as yet. From all the dialogue and item descriptions, Dung Eater seems to have an affinity towards the omens. In the Elden Ring universe, omens are seen as a curse. They are devoid of grace and hunted down by many, and for some reason, Dung Eater probably felt for them. It could be that maybe he too went through some type of mistreatment in his earlier years, similar to the omens, so he wanted to become like one. I mean, with a face like that, I would be mad at the world too. With the way the omens are treated, I think this made Dung Eater really angry at society itself on some Joker shit, to the point where he would go out of his way to kill and defile people and cursing them for eternity. It's also obvious that Dung Eater has a different worldview from many, as he sees the omens as a blessing while other people see them as a curse, which, to be fair, back in the age of the Crucible, the omens were definitely seen as a blessing. Until the age of the Earth Tree came about, where they are now shunned by everyone. All in all, I do think that wrath fits Dung Eater, as everything about his character shows that he has built up hatred and a desire for vengeance against the world. Now, those were all the characters that represent the 7 deadly sins of the Soulsborne universe, from Gwyn, the Lord of Cinder, who prides himself on his accomplishments, all the way up to Dung Eater, who is driven by wrath and seeks to curse the world. Hope you guys enjoyed the video and have a nice day.